Hello and welcome back to the AP US History Curriculum for Era 6. In this video, we'll be looking at topic 6.11, Reform Movements during the Gilded Age. We will continue our look at the growth of industrial capitalism, but this time we will look at how different groups sought to address some of the problems that developed because of it during this time period. So let's get to it. As the wealthy industrialists became more wealthy and the gap between rich and poor grew, there were increasingly those in society who wanted to show what exactly was going on so that it couldn't be ignored by those in power. Adherents to the social gospel were part of these early reform efforts, but it went well beyond that. Writers exposed the worst of society to an audience that was embracing a literary movement known as Realism, looking at the mundane, everyday experiences as they were in real life. They sought to tell a story as truthfully as possible without dramatizing or romanticizing it, with much of the focus being on the middle and lower classes of society. Henry George wrote the book Progress and Poverty, in which he argued that the capitalist system was starting to create a lot of inequality, so therefore this system could not be the best. Edward Bellamy, in his book Looking Backward, envisions himself being in the year 2000, looking back at the year 1887. He showed that the system of the 1880s was far more unequal compared to what he envisioned it would be like in the future. He thought that by the year 2000, Americans would have figured out a new system in which poverty and greed and inequality had all gone away. Other of these so-called early muckrakers exposed corruption and greed amongst industrialists, as well as discrimination and other issues. Ida Tarbell exposing Standard Oil, Ida Wells exposing the practice of lynching, and Thomas Nast exposing political corruption through his many political cartoons. Others embraced the idea of social gospel espoused by men like Andrew Carnegie, believing that Christian principles ought to be applied not just to oneself, but to cure the problems of society as well. Many Protestant preachers appealed, particularly to the middle class, that they should attempt to solve the problem of urban poverty as part of their Christian duty. The YMCA, though it had been founded overseas, promoted morality and good citizenship, providing shelter and other support, particularly to immigrants arriving in the port cities of the U.S. Similarly, the Salvation Army sought to convert the poor to Christianity, and in particular focused on reforming drunkards, whom they thought contributed to the spread of poverty. And of course, there's also the settlement house movement that we talked about in an earlier video. Bellamy's book, Looking Backward, took these ideas and introduced a vision of America as a socialist society in the future, suggesting that this may have been the answer to the problems of industrialization. This, of course, tied into many of the labor unions seeking to make the situation between workers and management more equitable, leading socialism to be connected to these movements and an eventual founding of the Socialist Party. As was the case in previous reform movements of the early 19th century, women were a large part of the reforms of the Gilded Age. Many women sought greater equality with men, participating in community reform efforts, expanding their education, and even gaining access to employment opportunities, particularly in nursing, teaching, and as secretarial labor. Many became involved in social clubs that sought to address the problems of society. The Women's Christian Temperance Union perceived alcohol as a cause and consequence of larger social problems, rather than as a personal weakness or failing, and so sought to create a sober and pure world by eliminating the cause of so much trouble. Their activities also took them into addressing issues of prostitution, public health and sanitation, and eventually the issue of suffrage, arguing that the vote was necessary in order to address the problems of society. And with so much emphasis on those societal problems, organizations like the WCTU were seen as socially acceptable for young women to become a part of. There were other women's suffrage organizations that had begun even earlier, including the National Women's Suffrage Organization and the American Women's Suffrage Association, but these organizations had been labeled as too focused, too confrontational, and even too radical by some. Though they worked to get the eventual 19th Amendment passed during the later years of the Progressive Era, there had been many attempts to vote already, implying that women already had the constitutional right to vote, based on what was implied by the 14th Amendment. But we'll look a little bit closer at that when we actually get to the Progressive Era in a future unit. Well, that about covers what you need to know for topic 6.11, Reform in the Gilded Age. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.